Okay, so people are joining in. I emailed out and I got two computers going on. Hey, Steve. I got two computers going on, so if it looks like I'm not looking at you, making good eye contact, I apologize. But I am trying to offer this in a couple different mediums, mainly because I know not everyone has Facebook or would want to use Facebook. But I'm also just testing out a couple different things just to see what works and what doesn't work. And so it seemed like, I'm not really sure why, but it seemed like this morning in the auditorium, the YouTube feed worked better. So it was nice to experiment with a couple different things to know what'll be best going forward. But again, this also just allows it to be available in two different places, so that anybody can see it, whether you have Facebook or not. Again, I emailed out the handouts. I'm kind of thinking seems like I saw on Facebook, thought there was an option to share my screen. Thought I saw that earlier. Huh, where did that go? Maybe not, maybe I made that up. Okay, well, technology, that's exactly right. I thought I saw that today. Okay, well, that's a bummer because I thought I was gonna be able to share the screen and show the handouts, but looks like I'm not gonna be able to do that. So I guess I could do like this the whole time. I could like hold up the handouts so you can see. But again, you can access those handouts through the email, and they have blanks. It's kind of the way I've been doing these handouts for this class, is that there's been blanks to fill in as we go through the material. So again, having those on hand and maybe even printed out, or if you can write on your tablet or something to fill those blanks, might be a nice way to follow along. But looks like we have a dozen or so people that are logged in. So we'll go ahead and get started since we're a few minutes after 5 o'clock here. Okay, so I realize some of you have been in the class, some of you haven't, and so some of this will kind of make sense what we're doing. Some of you may need a little more filling in, but basically this is a class on the book of Jeremiah, and this is going to be like let's see, 2 quarters. So what is that? 6 months. That it's going to take us to get through Jeremiah, and we've really just started. This is like would be the third class, and so we've been doing some background material to kind of pave the way for our study of Jeremiah. And so the first thing we talked about a couple weeks ago was the idea of the prophet and what a prophet is. Jeremiah obviously is a prophet, and so we talked some about the prophet's purpose, his responsibility, and what made the prophet different than, or what set the prophet apart, especially from people that would claim to be prophets. And so I'm going to review a little bit of that. This is on handout number 1. And this first couple of things I think is really relevant to what we're doing in this class, which is that the purpose of the prophet, I gave 3 things. The first being to interpret history, meaning that as things were happening, the prophet was able to tell the people, hey, look at what's happening to you right now, and this is why that's happening. Interesting tie into our sermon actually this morning, that we're kind of left without that today. It would be nice maybe to have prophets come along and say, hey, God says this is why this is happening. But the prophets for Israel did that very thing. The prophets for Israel told them, here's what's happening, right? This superpower is emerging in the region, and they're going to, besiege you or attack you, or they are attacking you. And here's why. It's because God is upset because of this, that, or the other, right? And so the prophets interpret history. That's their first purpose. And they also, the second thing we said was that they enforce covenants. And so maybe the easiest example of this is the covenant that God made with Israel and Mount Sinai. And we'll kind of start there today. But if you remember, that covenant was made with the people of Israel at Sinai, saying, you keep my commandments, you'll be my holy special people, I'll take care of you, so on and so forth. But if you break this covenant, if you forsake me, then here's the consequences of that. And so the prophets would come along later, and the prophets would say, hey, this is what the covenant said, and here's how you're stacking up against it. And most of the time, especially with that Mosaic covenant, it was you're forsaking the covenant, and so these are the consequences. So the prophets are holding the people accountable, so to speak, to the covenants. But we remember, and we'll talk about some of this today as well, that it wasn't just the Mosaic covenant. That we think of in Mount Sinai. God had also made a covenant with Abraham, and that covenant with Abraham was essentially God saying, I'm going to bless you and your descendants, and through you and your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, right? So throughout Israel's history, the prophets also remind the people of the covenant God made with Abraham, and says, God made this covenant. He's going to follow through. He's going to keep his promises. And a similar thing we could say about the third covenant that we mentioned, which is the covenant with David. That David, I'm going to establish your house. I'm going to put one of your descendants on the throne forever, and I'm making this covenant with you. And so the prophets will come along later and say, don't forget that God made this covenant with David, and he's going to be faithful to that covenant. Okay, so the prophets interpret history, the prophets enforce covenants, and we talked about how the prophets declare future events. Which is kind of the maybe main thing we think about with prophets. And it is a part of what they do, but it's not necessarily even the great part of what they do. And in many ways, their predictions of the future, so to speak, are really in the context of the first two things we talked about. That they predict events as a way of saying, here's where history is going, and here's how you should understand it. When you see these events unfold, this is the reasoning behind it. Okay, here's what's going on. And also maybe even enforcing the covenants and saying, this is what's going to happen because of you're breaking the covenant, or because God's promise, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's from handout number 1 about the purpose of the prophets. I gave 8 things that the prophets talk about, maybe topics or themes that we find throughout the prophets. We won't belabor that point, but it does kind of go in somewhat of a thematic order or thematic sequence. And that is, real quickly, if you already have it, this will be easier. If you're trying to write it all down, maybe you can pause and go slowly. But God is the Lord of history. He's the everlasting God above all. The election of Israel. Israel has been chosen by God to be a special people. The rebellion of Israel. Israel has forsaken God. Judgment to come. There's consequences for that rebellion. And God is going to bring those consequences on them, that punishment. There is divine compassion. In spite of the rebellion, in spite of the judgment, God cares about his people, does not want to see them destroyed and cut off forever. And so there's a call to repentance. Come back to me, renew your heart and your life and come back, repent. So call to repentance. And then there is an offer and a promise for those who will repent of redemption and restoration. And that hopeful message kind of overlaps into this this messianic picture of the kingdom of God. God is going to set up this kingdom with a descendant of David forever. And that will be kind of the grand ultimate result of what God is up to in history. Okay, so those are the 8 things from handout number 1. And we tied that into a chart that we use in the Isaiah class, a V chart about how Israel rebels against God, and so they are brought low to a moment, or to a point of retribution, God's punishment on the people. But there is restoration. There is hope for them on the other side. And in the middle there, they are called to repent to avoid the worst of the disaster. Okay, so that's a quick review, too much, but a quick review of class number 1, handout number 1, what the prophets were all about, at least what their message was all about. And the last part of that is about how the prophets don't fit in society, because God has claimed them for a different purpose. And Jeremiah is a perfect example of that. Okay, so that's what we started with this kind of laying the groundwork for Jeremiah. And then what we were doing next, as you see in handouts 2 and 3, is that we are discussing the history of Israel. So there's a lot here, and maybe too much. At some point, this may get kind of overdone or overbearing. But Jeremiah comes really at, in some ways, what would be the tail end of Israel's history. Their history will continue, and there's kind of the what happens after they go into exile and return. But in many ways, Jeremiah is seeing the twilight of Judah and Jerusalem and Israel in a larger sense. And so there's a lot of history leading up to the time of Jeremiah. And really, as well as we can understand it, and especially understand the arc of history leading to Jeremiah, I think that will help to make a lot of sense of what Jeremiah is saying in the book. And these will be things that we'll continue to refer back to. So we don't need necessarily to say all of it up front. But as much as we can kind of get out there and understand on the front end, then as we see things in Jeremiah and refer back to them over the next few months, they will make more sense. Okay, so if you're looking at handout number 2, again, these were emailed out just a minute ago on the Bel Air email group, the Yahoo groups. So if you saw that, if you have your phone or your computer, you can pull them up as PDFs, or if you can print them, you can even write in the blanks as we go, or just try to remember and write in the blanks later. But we had made it about halfway through. So we talked about Abraham and the patriarchs, and this idea that God made all these promises to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah. And really all of that, this is something we said in Wednesday's class, all of that can be summarized with one word. And that's blessing, or blessed, or bless. I mean, this is what is said in maybe all of those passages. I would think maybe all of them, but one or two, if that I put on this handout. God uses that word bless, or bless. This is what he told Abraham: I will bless you. Through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And there's a lot to that word. We don't want to take too much of a tangent here. But essentially, one way to think about it is that because of Adam's and Eve's rebellion against God, and because man had been cut off from God, that relationship with God, that fellowship with God had been lost, that original blessing, Genesis chapter 1 says that God made man in his image and he blessed him. And so, that, especially in its original sense, is probably something that we can't even wrap our minds around. That idea that in the beginning, when God made man and woman, and they were living in fellowship with God, and they were in the garden with him, they were blessed. And that's just a more profound and deep idea than we can really grasp on this side of the fall. Okay. But that blessing was lost because of sin, because of Adam and Eve's rebellion, right? And so one way to think about the promises to Abraham and the patriarchs is God saying, I am fixing that problem that started in Genesis chapter 3, that I am bringing the blessing back to mankind, back to man and woman. And I'm going to do that through Abraham and through Abraham's family. Okay, so now we know the end of the story, right? We know that what that is eventually pointing to is Jesus, who comes from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, comes from the people of Israel, and it is through Jesus, the son of Abraham, and the Son of God. It is through Jesus that God finally solves the problem of sin and makes it possible to have that ultimate and eternal reconciliation between God and man. Okay, so we know that. But if you're just kind of following the story of the Bible, what you see in Genesis is just that kind of vague notion, that kind of big picture notion that God is saying to Abraham and to his descendants, I'm going to bless the world through you. And so Abraham's family is singled out, so to speak, to be the family and to be the nation, because remember, that's part of the promise, to be the people through whom God blesses the world. And that's kind of why the Old Testament then kind of narrowly focuses in on this one family of people and tells their story all the way through the Old Testament. Okay, so we talked about the patriarchs. We talked a little bit about the Exodus, and I gave you some passages there. The Exodus is that kind of big event when God saves his people from captivity, and that is him demonstrating to them that he loves them, that he cares about them, and that he has chosen them for this special purpose. And he says in Exodus chapter 19, I bore you out on eagle's wings to bring you here to Mount Sinai, so that we can establish this covenant, that I will be your God, you will be my people, you are a people holy and special to me. And that deliverance from Egypt is God demonstrating exactly that. But remember that those passages also say that God's kind of goal in doing that was to make his glory known throughout the whole world, that people would know, that the whole world would know that he is God and he alone is God. Okay, so the Exodus has that kind of special significance for Israel and that kind of cosmic significance in terms of glorifying God in the world. So the people are led out of Sinai. They are a people at this point, over 1 million of them. Okay, this family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel, that has now become a great people. They are brought to Mount Sinai, and God establishes his covenant with them there. I gave a bunch of things on the handout in terms of what was communicated at Sinai. 10 Commandments, sort of the basis of the law. There is a lot of Sabbath law. That will be important in the book of Jeremiah. This idea that God had given his people these regular rhythms by which to remember him every seventh day, every seventh year, every seventh year, the year of Jubilee. And these were set aside for his people to set aside this time and to focus on God, to remember him, and to rest in their special relationship with him and to enjoy that. But they don't really ever do that. And that's part of what comes into play in the book of Jeremiah. Okay, so there's instructions for the tabernacle that they're told to construct so that God can dwell among them. There's instructions for worship, particularly sacrifices, so that atonement can be made for sin and that relationship can be maintained. There are instructions for feast days. The Day of Atonement in particular is what I gave you there in Leviticus 16 and 17. Again, kind of the day that the high priest would go in and make atonement for the sins of the people. Okay? And then there is a lot of stuff that we remember about ritual purity, being unclean versus being clean, and what you eat, what you wear, what you touch, all that kind of stuff. This is the hardest part of the law for us to understand. But really, in the end, it is a symbol, I think, of the next thing, which is moral purity. The people were learning about being different. They were learning about setting themselves apart. Okay, so eating differently was, for example, a way for them to in a very tangible way, be different, because God had called them in terms of their morality to be different. Okay, and that's why, just as a side point here, when you move into the new covenant, the ritual purity laws is what kind of passes away, and what the New Testament talks about as being shadows of something greater. But if you look at the moral code of the Old Testament, and maybe aside from the particular punishments that were given in the law of Moses, But the essence of the moral code in the Old Testament doesn't change when you come into the New Covenant, because these are the moral laws that God has put in place. He called his people to be different and to be obedient in those ways. And the ritual purity laws were maybe a way to symbolize that holiness in everyday life. Okay. And then the last thing I gave you there was the terms of the covenant. And that's where we left off on Wednesday, for those of you following along with that. Okay. This is a little bit hard because there's no sense of body language, eye contact. For all I know, the 20 people that I see that are on right now have turned on their computers and they've gone to watch a movie or something. So let me know. Yeah, I'm not saying you have to, but if you have a question, if you have a thought, feel free to comment and to let that be known. It can be, if we make it, it can be more of a participatory experience. If you have questions to ask or things to add, and we'll try to work that in. Thank you, Kim. That's a reassurance. That boosts my confidence. So, but if not, you guys know I can talk, and that's what I do. So I'll keep talking as long as I feel like it. Okay, so here's where I want to start, and that is in Leviticus 26. So let's turn there to Leviticus chapter 26, and Leviticus chapter 26 is something we described earlier, which is God saying, here's the covenant I'm making with you. If you keep it, here's what's going to happen. If you don't keep it, here's what's going to happen. And we're going to focus on the negative for now. But you could look at the beginning of Leviticus chapter 26, and you could see that he says, for instance, in Leviticus 26, verse 3, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then I shall give you rains in the season, the land will yield its produce, the trees of the field will bear fruit, so on and so forth, right? So the first part is you keep the commandments, you keep the covenant, I'm going to bless you, would be another way of saying that. And all these things, you'll have victory over your enemies. I will dwell among you. Notice verse 11, I will make my dwelling among you. My soul will not reject you. I will also walk among you and be your God, and you shall be my people. Okay, so that's if you keep the covenant, right? That blessing on his people. But notice verse 14, he says, if you do not obey me and do not carry out all these commandments, if instead you reject my statutes, and if your soul abhors my ordinances so as to not carry out all my commandments, and so break my covenant, I in turn will do this to you. And there's a colon there in our English Bibles, and everything that comes after that is what God will do to the people if they do not keep the covenant. So there's a bunch of terrible things, plague and pestilence and so on, that are listed in the following verses, but skip down to verse 27. This is where we want to focus on. Again, this is kind of where we're headed when we talk about the book of Jeremiah. Okay. Verse 27 of Leviticus 26. Yet, if in spite of this you do not obey me, so I've done all these terrible things, these punishments to wake you up, if you do not obey me, but act with hostility against me, then I will act with wrathful hostility against you. And I, even I, will punish you 7 times for your sins. Further, you will eat the flesh of your sons, and the flesh of your daughters you will eat. I will destroy your high places, cut down your incense altars, heap your remains on the remains of your idols, for my soul shall abhor you. I will lay waste your cities as well, and will make your sanctuaries desolate. I will not smell your soothing aromas. I will make the land desolate, so that your enemies who settle in it will be appalled over it. You, however, I will scatter among the nations, and will draw out a sword after you, as your land becomes desolate and your cities lay waste. Okay, so we kind of see the end of the story from the beginning. That God says, okay, after all, if you continue to disobey, in spite of all these things that I'll do, ultimately, I'm going to remove you from the land. and not only just remove you from the land, and you're going to live among as exiles among foreigners, but I'm also going to bring a total destruction, destroy the city, destroy the sanctuary, lay waste, make your land desolate, right? So we kind of see where this is going, or at least even if you're just in the moment, you're realizing where this could go if the people are unfaithful. Notice, by the way, the next verse or several verses here, as we put together this idea of the Sabbaths that we mentioned earlier. It says, then the land will enjoy, this is Leviticus 26, verse 34, then the land will enjoy its Sabbaths all the days of the desolation, while you are in your enemy's land. Then the land will rest and enjoy its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it will observe the rest, which it did not observe on your Sabbaths, while you were living on it. As for those of you who may be left, I will also bring weakness into the hearts of the land of their enemies, and sound of a driven leaf will chase them, and even when no one is pursuing them, they will flee from the sword, and they will fall. Okay. By the way, if you continue reading in Leviticus 26, we actually get the kind of, in some ways, the more of the story, which is that even once the people are removed from the land, those that turn their hearts back to God will be brought back to the land. So there will be a restoration, which Jeremiah himself will look forward to. But I wanted to point out this idea of the terms of the covenant. I'm giving you this land. I'm bringing you in this land, giving you stability and protection in it. But if you forsake the covenant, then I will remove you from the land. I'll destroy the land. And this particular note about the Sabbaths, that for all the Sabbath years that you don't let the land rest, then I will kind of bring that to the land and force that upon the land, so to speak, by removing you from it and giving the land an opportunity to finally have the Sabbaths or the rest that it never received. Okay, so that's the terms of the covenant, or at least part of the terms of the covenant. And where this goes is in Leviticus into Numbers and Deuteronomy. And if you're keeping up with the Bible reading we're doing, this is exactly where we are. So we've talked some about this. But Leviticus is the law received at Mount Sinai. Okay. Numbers is describing the journey of the people towards the promised land. But you may remember that they don't make it. At least those particular people don't make it. And they rebel against God. And because of that, God tells them this whole generation is going to fall in the wilderness, and you're going to wander for 40 years as everybody dies. And the next generation, your children, will be the ones that go into the promised land. Okay. And then the book of Deuteronomy really exists partly because there is now this new generation. And so Deuteronomy is a retelling, a second giving, and a kind of re-emphasizing of the law given in Exodus and Leviticus. One, because it's a new generation, and two, because they are being prepared to finally cross over the Jordan and enter into the promised land. And Moses, who is not going in, by the way, remember he had to see it but not enjoy it because of his own disobedience. He is telling them, when you enter into the land, this is what God expects of you. So that's what Deuteronomy is, and that's why you have this kind of another version of what we read in Leviticus 26 in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. Another a giving of the terms of the covenant. And Steve points out the symmetry of blessings and cursings, and that's exactly what you see in Deuteronomy 26, 27, 28, I believe. They actually stand on two different mountains and they shout back to each other. These are the blessings if you keep the covenant. These are the curses if you don't keep the covenant. But all that is reiterated in the book of Deuteronomy as the people are prepared to go into the land of Canaan. Okay, so what's the point of all this? The point is that the people knew. They were aware. God had communicated to them fully. I want to bless you. I want you to be my people. I am putting you in this land to take care of you, to give you everything you need, and to make you great among the nations, so that this blessing can be brought to the whole world. Okay. But unfortunately, really the story of the Old Testament from the beginning is the refusal of the people to accept that calling that God had given them, to live up to that calling that God had given them, and to keep the covenant that God had made with them. Okay, so on your handout, handout number 2, again, these were emailed out just a few minutes before we started. I gave you two of the most famous examples of that early on, which is the golden calf incident in Exodus 32, before they had even left Mount Sinai. And then Numbers 13 is what we referred to earlier, where they are told, hey, go spy out the land, prepare to enter into it and conquer it. And 10 of the 12 spies come back and say, we have no chance. We can't take this land. The people are huge. The walls are huge. And we're like grasshoppers. We'll just get smushed. And so because of their disbelief, then they are kept out of the promised land in Numbers 13. So that kind of indicates from the beginning that that's going to be the theme of the Old Testament. And that continues even when they enter into the land. So moving on to the next kind of period of history, which is the Conquest and the Judges. The book of Joshua, which comes next after Deuteronomy, obviously. The book of Joshua is in many ways an encouraging book because Joshua is a good leader. He's following in the footsteps of Moses. And through his righteous leadership and courageous leadership, the people enter into the land. They have victories over the people of the land. They are starting to bring about this great conquest that God had provided for them. But it's not as good as it could be, I guess. And a lot of that we see when we come into the book of Judges. The first chapter of the book of Judges says, hey, with Joshua's leadership, the people went in and they started conquering the land. But the first chapter of Judges goes on to say, this section of the land wasn't conquered and the people were left in it. This tribe couldn't conquer this region, and so the Canaanites remained among them, so on and so forth. The people didn't achieve a full conquest of the land. And the way that those passages are, the way that the text reads in those passages, I think makes it clear that it's because they lacked faith in God to go in and drive out the people as he had commanded. And so those people hanging around, the people of the land, the Canaanites, then those people hanging around in the land among the Israelites kind of sets the stage for or we could say they're like weeds in the middle of the land that are going to draw the people away towards these pagan and idolatrous practices. And so again, just starting out on the wrong foot, even with Joshua's great conquest, people are left behind. That will be bad influences on them. Okay, then the rest of the book of Judges talks about that moral decline. That's fairly familiar, so we won't belabor that too much. But that passage I gave you in Judges chapter 2 is really interesting because it describes that turn from the generation of Joshua and their faithfulness. But as soon as that generation has passed away, the next generation has forgotten God. They've forgotten what God did for them in that conquest. And so they turn really away from God to follow after their own desires. And that famous last verse of Judges 21:25 says, in those days, in the days of the judges, there was no king in Israel. And so every man did what was right in his own eyes. Okay, and that's important in moving forward, this idea of there being no king in Israel. Because what will happen in the next book, in the book of 1 Samuel, is that we will hear about the kind of setting up of the monarchy in Israel, of the kings of Israel, right? Remember back in the book of Genesis, God, one of the promises God had made to Judah, well, really Jacob had given Judah, his son Judah, this blessing, but God clearly seemed to be behind this blessing. And Jacob, or Israel, says of Judah, the scepter will not depart from your house, right? So there is this prophecy that the tribe of Judah will be the ruling tribe, and through them kings will come to rule over God's people. right? And so God had in his mind, I think all along, that there would be kings, but good kings. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, I believe it's Deuteronomy chapter 17. I can check that real quick. And in Deuteronomy 17, part of the preparation for the people to enter into the land, Moses actually says, hey, you're going to ask for a king, and God's going to give you a king, but the king needs to behave or to rule in a certain way, right? And they need to be just. They need to be fair. They need to not be oppressive and taking advantage of their power and position for personal gain, so on and so forth, okay? So we have the promise of Judah and the scepter staying in the house of Judah. We have the instructions of Deuteronomy 17 before the people enter into the land about a king ruling over Israel and how that what that should look like. But then when the people enter in, there is no king, and because there is no king, the people own eyes. Okay, where are we going with all this? Well, I think that is relevant for the story that is told in 1 Samuel, which is that after a period of time of there being judges ruling over God's people or delivering God's people really as they face different crises, eventually the people do come to Samuel, who's the current judge, and they ask him in 1 Samuel 8 to give us a king like all the nations. So this is what God said would happen. The people are going to ask for a king. And you might say, well, that's what they're supposed to do. God said there would be a king. They said that there would be kings that ruled over his people. Okay? But that passage makes it clear that their desire for a king is not a good desire. One, the way they ask the question, give us a king that we can be like all the other nations, that doesn't sound like a good motivation. They just want to be like the other nations. Remember, that was the whole point of the law, was to just make them distinct from the other nations, that they would be a holy and special people. So this desire, give us a king that we can be like all the other nations, runs totally counter to the calling they had as God's special people. Okay, so there's a problem there. But remember, in that story, Samuel there in 1 Samuel chapter 8, he is hurt, I guess you could say, by the request that they make, and he's thinking, well, I've been ruling over this people, so to speak. I've been their judge. I've been their counselor. I've been the one that people go to for decisions, for rulings, for help, etc. So he feels a little bit put out by the fact that they would want a king instead of the current arrangement, right? But beyond that, God actually tells Samuel on that occasion, 1 Samuel chapter 8, he says, you know what, Samuel, don't feel too bad about this. They are not rejecting you. They are rejecting me, that is God, from being king over them. All right. So put that together with what the book of Judges said. The book of Judges says there's no king in Israel. And so every man did what was right in his own eyes. All right. When we come to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and God says they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me from being their king, we learn that the problem in Israel is not simply that there is not a human king to rule over them and to lead them in the ways of justice and righteousness. The real problem is that God is not their king, that they're not looking to him as the ultimate authority, and that's where all of their problems come from. All right. And so the people want a king like all the other nations, and God gives them one. And he gives them Saul. And really, one way to think about it is that the people asked for a king like all the other nations, and so God gave them a king like all the other nations. And Saul is a king that is a typical king in maybe the worst sense of that. Although he seems to be maybe a little bit humble or understated at the beginning, as his reign goes on, it is clear that he is really just concerned about himself. He's concerned about his position, his power in the people, or his influence over the people. And so the classic case of Saul's failure to be the kind of king and leader he's supposed to is in chapter 13, where he's been told to wait for Samuel to arrive and offer the sacrifice. But he does not wait. And in his panic, he offers the sacrifice. He kind of feels the pressure of the moment weighing down on him. But notice that. So if you're following along in your Bible, and again, these handouts are available. They've been emailed out. And if you don't have these, let me know. Maybe you can just comment and leave your email. I can email these to you after we're done here. But in 1 Samuel 13 and verse 13, you can see in the verses leading up to this, Saul making his excuses for disobeying God. But notice in 1 Samuel 13:13, Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as a ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Okay. So this is Saul in a nutshell. The people wanted him. He looked like a great king from the eyes of the world. He's tall, he's handsome, he's strong in battle. And yet, it is clear here that he is not the king that God wants, because he will not trust God, he will not obey God. And so through his prophet Samuel, God tells Saul, "You've lost the kingdom. You could have received this kingdom enduring in your family, but you lost it. I'm going to tear the kingdom from you." And notice he says, "I'm going to give, I have sought out," the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. We use that phrase a lot about the heart of David. It could be that really instead of that, what God is saying, or what Samuel is saying, is that Saul is the king that the people wanted, but David is the king of God's heart. He's the king that God wants. And remember, we've kind of been leading up to that distinction, right? Because the people's problem was not that they didn't have a king. The problem was that God was not their king. And so God, when they ask for a king, gives them a bad king, and so they can see what that's like, so to speak. But then after the bad king, he's going to give them the king that he really wanted all along. And that, of course, is going to be David. And we're familiar with David's story. In fact, there's been a class on the books of Samuel recently. And so we can move fairly quickly through this. But let's look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. This is one of those passages that is really important to know and to understand in the kind of big picture of the Old Testament, and a passage that I'm sure we will refer back to probably more than once in our study of the book of Jeremiah. 2 Samuel chapter 7. By the way, we're coming up on 45 minutes here. We didn't necessarily start right into it when we began. We're not necessarily on a strict time schedule anyway, but just to give you a heads up, I'll probably keep yammering on until the Facebook tells me we've gone for about an hour. And then, that'll probably be torture enough for you. And so we'll kind of end there, and then wherever we end, we'll pick up there on Wednesday when we do this again. So 2 Samuel chapter 7, notice what God tells David. This is in the context of David asking or saying, "I'm going to build God a temple." And God comes back to him and says, "No, you're not. I didn't ask for that. So you're not going to do that. You're not going to build me a house." Instead, here's what he says. So 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12. Really go back to verse 11. The second half of verse 11, 2 Samuel 7. "The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you." Okay, so you see the turn here. "No, David, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house." Okay, what does he mean by that? Verse 12. "When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you. I will establish his kingdom. When he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men, and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever. Your throne shall be established forever. Okay, so God tells David, I'm going to establish your house forever. And your son, your descendant, and notice that how that term is kind of vague here, right? Your son, your descendant, he will build me a house. And so you think, oh, well, David's son Solomon will build the temple. But as he goes on here, he talks about this, your son will sit on the throne and he'll reign forever. And he'll minister justice and righteousness and all this stuff. And you start reading that and you think, well, that doesn't seem to really describe Solomon. That seems to be describing something more. And so I think we see in 2 Samuel 7 what we've already described. God making a covenant with David and saying, your line will endure, okay? And eventually, one of your descendants will be king forever, right? So again, we know the end of the story. We know Jesus, the son of David, will fulfill this and be that forever king, son of David, son of God. Right? But this also lays the groundwork for what the rest of the Old Testament, a lot of what we're going to be talking about a little bit today and then more on Wednesday, which is the kings of Judah that will reign in perpetuity until the people are taken into captivity. And we'll see how many times this promise is referred back to as God says, hey, I promised David that there will be kings on his throne in perpetuity, forever. And so we see that in God fulfilling that throughout the pages of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then that story is kind of retold in 1 and 2 Chronicles. Okay, so this is a huge moment. This is a covenant God makes with David and this establishing of his house forever. But we go to Solomon, and Solomon, complicated like many of the kings, but suffice it to say that Solomon begins well. He asks for wisdom, if you remember, in 1 Kings chapter 3. He's able to consolidate the kingdom and to rule over this unified kingdom that David left for him. He builds the temple for God. That's kind of a grand description in 1 Kings 6, 7, and 8. He dedicates the temple to God, and everything seems to be great. Talks about him writing Psalms and Proverbs and wisdom, which we have much of that for us in our Old Testaments. But Solomon, because of the influence of the many wives, many foreign wives he had married, is lured away from being faithful to God and begins to bring in other forms of worship alongside the worship of Jehovah, we're assuming to accommodate these wives that he had married and to kind of bring their gods into the picture, have a quasi pantheon of sorts, right? Keep that idea in mind, by the way, that Solomon is going to bringing in other gods, that he is not forbidding Jehovah worship, but he's bringing in other gods. That's really what's happening almost all the time throughout Israel's history. It is not that these kings or these people are removing the worship of Jehovah. It is that they are bringing in the worship of other gods into their religion, so to speak. Okay. So this is where we turn to the third handout here. And we'll get a little bit into this, but won't be able to finish it. But we will talk about some of this as I kind of get my stuff situated here. And this is the idea of the divided kingdom. Notice in 1 Kings, so we talked about where to find the beginning of Solomon's story, but notice in 1 Kings chapter 11, as it describes the fall of Solomon or the failure of Solomon, really. Notice in 1 Kings 11, 9 through 13. Okay, it says, "Now the Lord was very angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I had chosen. Okay, a couple important main points here that we're going to see this kind of thing repeated over and over again. One is this message of consequence. Because you have not been faithful to me, Solomon, the great Solomon, as wise as he was, as much as we remember him for his wisdom, okay? The great Solomon is told by God, because you did not keep my commandments, I am going to tear the kingdom away from you. So God brings about this thing called the divided kingdom because of Solomon, as a consequence for Solomon's sin. We want to recognize that. But did you notice the last verse of that is this other theme that we're going to see continued throughout the story of the kings, which is, but I will not do it in your days, he tells Solomon, and I will leave one tribe, I will leave Judah and Jerusalem and keep your son on the throne over that segment because of David, because of that promise made to David. And so already we're seeing that covenant made in 2 Samuel 7 as God's commitment to the house of David, in spite of the failures of his descendants, in this instance, Solomon. Okay, so because of Solomon's sin, the kingdom will be torn in two, but there will continue in the southern kingdom, in the tribe of Judah, there will continue to be a son of David reigning on the throne. Okay. By the way, just as I meant to point this out earlier, this passage does not tell us. This here says that God told Solomon this. We don't know exactly how he did that. Could have been direct revelation. But I meant to point out, if you notice with Saul and with David, that the messages that God had for them. For Saul, it was, you've rejected me, I'm going to reject you, and your line's coming to an end. For David, it was, I will put your son on the throne forever. I established this covenant with you. In both those instances, it was prophets that communicated that message. So Samuel, the prophet, communicated that message to Saul, and Nathan, the prophet, communicated that message to David in 2 Samuel 7. And so we should notice in these history books the roles of the prophets. We'll see more of that going forward. But it was the prophet that would go to the king and say, here's what's going on, here's what God is doing, and here's what that means for you. And a lot of it has to do with enforcing the covenants or the commitments and the consequences that these people had bound themselves to. Okay, and we see something similar with that with Solomon, although we're not told that it was a prophet that brought this information to him. Okay, so God tears up the kingdom. We had a united kingdom for a short time with Saul, and then that was given over to David, and then to his son Solomon. But because of Solomon's sin, the kingdom is divided, and 10 of those tribes go to a man named Jeroboam. And that story is told to us in the rest of 1 Kings chapter 11. And notice in those verses that God actually tells Jeroboam, we're seeing this again, if you will, this is becoming such a familiar construction, if you will keep my commandments, then I will provide you, I'll give you an enduring house. In fact, in 1 Kings 11, verse 37 to 39, I think I gave you, notice that he even compares it to the house of David and says, you shall reign over whatever you desire, you will be king over Israel. Then it will be that if you will listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes, my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Thus I will afflict the descendants of David for this, but not always. Jeroboam becomes king, the first king of this northern kingdom of Israel. We are so familiar with where we're going next, which is Israel's total failure to be faithful to God, right? And Jeroboam himself, his failure to be faithful to God. I think we're so familiar with that we forget this initial promise to Jeroboam. God actually tells Jeroboam, if you will keep my commandments, you'll be like another David, and you will reign over this segment of God's people, these tribes. You will reign over Israel. Your line will be established in perpetuity, so to speak, right? That's kind of, I think, is fascinating. And so he promises Jeroboam this enduring house if he will be faithful, if he will keep God's commandments, if he will covenant, so on and so forth. But, and this kind of kicks off maybe where we'll pick up on Wednesday, the trajectory of the line of the kings of Israel is downward from the beginning. Jeroboam introduces idol worship. If you remember, he sets up a golden calf in Dan, which is the far north of Israel, and in Bethel, which is kind of the far south, right on the border between Israel and Judah. And if you remember, you go read that passage in 1 Kings 13, the reason Jeroboam does that is not because he has a sincere, religious experience and says, I think building golden calves would be the most pleasing thing to God. I just really feel in my heart that's what he commands me to do. It wasn't that. It's obviously against the commandments of God to worship an idol. But if you read the story, the reason he does it is for really political reasons, to say, hey, I got people up here in Israel. If they go to Jerusalem for worship, then, they're going to defect and they're going to leave my kingdom. And he was afraid of losing that power, that influence, whatever. And so he says, well, let's have more convenient places of worship. That way people will stay more loyal to me and to my kingdom. And so for political purposes or political reasons, he introduces idol worship in Israel. And this idol worship of Jeroboam, the golden calves that he sets up, will be a thorn in the flesh of Israel and really be their downfall all the way through until they are removed and taken into captivity. Okay, so Jeroboam's house is wiped out. And at that point, after a few of his descendants do succeed him, his house is completely wiped out, and we instead have kind of coups and uprisings and assassinations. You can pick which of those words you like best to fill in the blanks, but the state of kings in Israel becomes no different than what you would see in any other pagan, non-God-fearing nation, which is the people just vying for power, using any means necessary to get power. And once they get it, someone else comes behind and stabs them in the back to take over the throne. And so we have coups and assassinations that kind of define Israel for the next several generations after Jeroboam. And then the last thing I'll give you is what's going on in the south. Well, during all this time in Israel in the south, we have the descendants of David and Solomon. Rehoboam being the first. It is his kind of foolishness that kind of prompts the division, prompts people to follow Jeroboam to the north. Although again, the kind of concept, the reasoning for that goes back to Solomon. It's in Rehoboam's time that the division actually takes place. And then after Rehoboam, we have some different. We have several generations. Some are good, some are bad, but no one's really great. Asa is pretty good. He institutes some reforms to help the people be more faithful to God. Jehoshaphat is okay, pretty good, does some good things, but has some fatal flaws that we'll talk about on Wednesday. But that's kind of where Judah's at in this time period. And so we're going to quit there. Again, I've emailed out these handouts. It looks like this. I'll show each here. And I email them as PDFs to the Bel Air email group. If you would like these and aren't on that group or didn't get them, then let me know. I'll send them to you. And we will pick up with handout number 3 on Wednesday, probably around 7:30, 8 o'clock. I'll send that out. But we'll continue our study there. And so between now and then, if you want to print out that handout and use it, fill it out as we go. Hopefully that will be a helpful study tool for you. And when we do get back to having regular Bible classes at the building, all of this will be printed out, and so you can fill in your booklet with all of the handouts and put together a complete set and have that for future use. So that's it, and we'll pick up again on Wednesday. Thank you, everybody.